Okay, let's get started.
Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. My name is Justin Engel and I'm an associate professor of marketing at the University of Montana College of Business. I also host a podcast called A New Angle. Welcome to tonight's installment of the University of Montana Alumni Virtual Engagement Series. This series is designed to keep you engaged and informed about the many great things going on at the University of Montana, and it is brought to you by the UM Alumni Association. Tonight we are using the Zoom webinar system, so please use the Q&A feature on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to submit a question at any time. I'll be curating questions for Mike after he finishes his brief presentation. Tonight, we once again have my great colleague, Michael Braun. Mike has been teaching at the University of Montana's College of Business since 2006. Previously, he spent a decade in industry, in publishing, direct marketing, and investment banking. His research focuses on disruption and organizational decline, recessionary strategies, and business model innovation. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Justin. Great to be here again. Nice to see everybody, and I just want to say thank you for having me on.
So do you have some brief remarks, and then we'll do Q&A after that?
That sounds great. So what I'm going to do is just a screen share of just some, slides that I have, just about 10, 15 minutes, really meant to provide a little bit of a landscape and then also, seed some thoughts and ideas on the future of work. And then, this is really a topic that lends itself to discussion just because it is so multifaceted and obviously it is playing out in the now. So what I'd like to do is just get a little bit of the definition of the future of work out of the way, so then we can start to operationalize it and really understand the implications of the future of work on what's probably most important to many people, which is their occupations, and what are some of these displacements that we talk about so often. Also, what are some of the emerging skills and capabilities that we are anticipating at this point? And then I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about what leadership sounds like in future of work. And this is not just sort of organizational leadership, but I think it also is about personal and self-leadership, if you will. And just so everybody understands, I mean, there's sort of a dialogue that's been unfolding pre-COVID. And I think now what we're seeing is sort of a different veneer on the future of work discussions. And that's why I have on here, what now? So what has this pandemic really done to maybe change the narrative of future of work? So as Justin said, my background was in industry pre-academia, and I was also with dot-com startups and that flamed out and venture financing. So, there's been an interest in technology and innovation for a long time there. And then it got amplified with my research focus on disruption, innovation, and organizational decline. I was on a couple of weeks ago talking about recessions and how to navigate recessionary environments. And I think that what we're going to talk about today with future of work is actually part and parcel of the disruption of this current recession, which was caused by coronavirus. So these are all very much intertwined. And it really comes to my personal interest in trying to understand technology, society, and sort of the management of firms through some of these disruptive periods. Again, I'm not an economist. I'm not I'm not even a technologist, if you will. If anything, I lean more towards being a Luddite. I tend to be a late adopter. But I'm a strategist, so I look for patterns and then directions, and my hope is always that I can maybe peek around the curve a little bit, which kind of makes it difficult, but I nonetheless try. So here is the definition of future of work. And folks, if it looks fuzzy to you, then that's what it's supposed to be. Future of work, if you try to look up any kind of definition, it's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. It is a multifaceted, very complex type of topic that really talks about not just technologies and automation that are at the heart of this, but also the impact of these technologies, not just on work and organizations, but really on how we live, how we communicate to one another, how we organize, you know, from all the way at the sort of the team level to organizations, and then as a society. So my view is that to really get a better handle on what this future of work means, it's helpful to sort of look back a little bit, try to understand what's happened before, and then maybe take some of those anchor points and try to extrapolate forward. And what I have here is really sort of the 4 industrial revolutions. We have 3 plus the one that is unfolding right now. The first one here is you know, the advent of steam in the 1760s that obviously brought on the first sort of period of automation, where we saw, for instance, you know, the cotton mills that were driven by automated steam-powered gins, cotton gins. We also obviously saw at that point the emergence of the railroads, especially in England, which was sort of the central part of the first industrial revolution. The second one, we had the emergence of electricity, right? And this was obviously using copper wire. All of a sudden, we're seeing that, you know, we're seeing cities with light bulbs. We're seeing the telegraph and the telegram make its appearance. This is around the 1870s. And we saw immense productivity gains. And obviously, the world even got a little smaller at that point, as all of a sudden we were able to communicate across vast distances. The third industrial revolution really came after World War II with the introduction of the microprocessor, and taking the power of the microprocessor and putting it onto the shop floor to really bring automation to a lot of, for instance, you know, organizational processes. We saw that, especially when it came to the workplace, we saw computers, you know, process and automate a lot of sort of, you know, skills and capabilities that before had been done by hand. Then this last one that, you know, the World Economic Forum pegged as the 4th industrial revolution is really about the vast amount of data that started to be created in the late 1990s and then early 2000s, when we had the emergence of the internet. So what we have to understand is that throughout the first 3 industrial revolutions, there's always been jobs that have been displaced, that have been destroyed, entire sort of occupations that gave way to new ones, right? So whereas, for instance, before we had a lot of cottage industries of fabric production, now these things were automated into textile mills. Obviously, we also saw that, for instance, the, you know, lamplighter that used to make the rounds as the sun went down was displaced by electricity. Or then we had, you know, through automation and desktop publishing, the typesetters that went away. Also, if you think about the typing pools that were so prevalent in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, well, once you had a desktop computer with Microsoft Word and all the other productivity tools, well, so went the typing pools. And then the one that's probably closest to my heart is good old Blockbuster attendant. Many of you will remember those entire experiences of taking yourself on a Thursday or Friday night to the local Blockbuster to find the new release, hoping that it was indeed there, roaming the aisles, trying to figure out what you were going to rent, and then dealing with those late fees, those pesky late fees. Well, it was really Netflix that in the late 90s, you know, using first DVD by mail and then obviously streaming, put Blockbuster out of business within just 7 years, 8 years. So it's pretty amazing when we think about the ongoing displacement of jobs throughout. So there is precedent for it. What's different about this fourth industrial revolution is that what we're seeing now is a steeper and more accelerated curve when it comes to technology adoption and usage. And we can kind of peg it around maybe 2014, 2015, when we see the confluence or the convergence of these, super technologies. So if you think about it, I mean, we only saw the iPhone make its emergence about 12, 13 years ago. And this was layered on top of the internet, where all of a sudden we were all empowered with our own little devices. And then we had social media make its appearance. Some of you may remember Friendster or MySpace, but obviously with Facebook, then it really got cranked up. And then we had a bunch of other ones as well. By the time 2014, 2015 rolled around, we had more than 50% of, at least here in the US, adoption of the smartphone, with individuals seeding their little plot of land, which is the smartphone, with amazing amounts of information, with everything that they liked or disliked or visited or streamed, so on and so forth. These little plots of land, digital land, started to aggregate all of this usage information. And with companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google and Apple, it really started to put a lot of information into a receptacle, kind of like almost pulling back that slingshot and making it ready to deploy. Well, now that's what we're having. We're having these companies figuring out how they can actually deploy some of this data through a lot of other technologies that are making their appearance. So when we're talking about the future of work, yes, we're really talking about the use of artificial intelligence through all of these other things, whether it's robotics, whether it's drones, thinking about blockchain enhancements, augmented reality and virtual reality, all being data driven. And, whereas before, up until now, maybe we've seen sort of experimentation a little bit of the deployment when we're thinking about the Netflix algorithm and how it makes recommendations on movies, or, talking to Alexa and getting, this device to basically tell us what the weather is like or make suggestions on the next tune that we want to listen to. Now we're going to see that a lot of this deployment of data is going to get supercharged, and it's going to have a heck of an impact on our daily lives. I think much of the majority of the discussion has really been around predictions of job losses due to automation. And these are all over the place. Really, when we look at predictions and we look at the employment market in the US, for instance, we have about 160, 170 million people in the workforce. And you can see that, everybody has sort of their range of predictions, everywhere from sort of saying it's going to be on the lower end at around, maybe 16 or 20 million to it's going to be at least half, right? And I think this is interesting, but it's not necessarily useful, because we have to think about what that actually means and put it into a context of, well, wait a minute. Are we talking complete displacement, or are we also talking deconstruction of jobs, right? So what we mean by this is that there's a spectrum. It's much more nuanced with shades of gray, where, of course, like with the other three industrial revolutions, we had jobs being completely displaced or go the way of the dinosaur, but then we're also going to have a lot of jobs that will be deconstructed in terms of their skills and capabilities. Thinking about, wait a minute, we have 60% of all occupations where maybe at least sort of 25, 30% of those occupations or the skill sets can be automated, right? And in a way, those might actually bring in new productivity and allow us to maybe focus our efforts elsewhere. The other thing is, we want to think about all those jobs that are going to be created through some of these emerging technologies. I mean, some of the jobs already out there, if you think about it, sure, maybe we don't have the blockbuster attendant anymore, but now we have, video bloggers, and we have folks who obviously, make loads of money reviewing products on YouTube and TikTok and so on and so forth. We also see that there are actually digital therapists out there who will help you manage your digital lifestyle. There are camps where you can go, where you can just unplug if you really need to just get away. And, you know, the only thing that will make you unplug is the lack of any kind of cell service or Wi-Fi, right? And then we are even seeing some emerging ones when it comes to some of the technologies that are not necessarily just purely technology oriented, but are really around the realm of technology and the efficiencies that it brings. One of the ones that I'm really interested in is food designers who are thinking about how they can take some of these non-meat or non-meat based foods out there and really come up with entirely new categories of food, which is just beginning to make its advent. I'll talk about that more later. But really, we want to think about the core skills. So what are the core skills and how vulnerable are they to automation, right? And then what is it that the market really values in terms of the delivery of those skills and capabilities? And when I talk about the market, it's not just consumers. It's also obviously employers out there, it's organizations, it's industries. So when we match up the core skills and the value delivery, then we'll get a much better sense of which jobs are going to sort of be displaced, which ones are going to be augmented with new skills and capabilities, and then really entirely new categories of jobs and occupations that, well, in large part, we can't even fathom or think of. We don't have that much of a creative knack for it yet. We have to see how these things roll out. So in pulling back a little bit from sort of the industries and occupations, we can actually already see some of the skills and capabilities that are increasingly finding traction or are going to be in demand. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but when we think about it, we do have, of course, understanding of technologies, emerging technologies, and really how to navigate those. So these are technology skills where we will have to understand how to interface with different kinds of technologies. We're also going to have to understand how to sort of digitize, manipulate digital information, how to scrub it, how to deploy it, how to make sense out of it, really understanding the competencies and how to take out just data and make it actionable and informative information that can help us in doing our jobs. We also have cognitive skills. These are really of interest. So sure, the critical thinking and problem solving has been there, but the one that I really am interested in is cross-disciplinary thinking, or what is also known as cognitive flexibility. And when we're talking about cognitive flexibility, it means that you can quickly sort of synapse between different domains. And what I love what the author Spiro and colleagues talk about when they think about sort of crisscrossing landscapes very quickly and having the flexibility and agility to work in very different sort of environments and make adjustments and be able to switch back and forth. And I think this one really comes to when we're thinking about what artificial intelligence is today. It's very narrow in that, you know, it allows us to sort of streamline and sort of, you know, increase the efficiency and the speed of very specific types of applications, but AI still is a far way from doing very sort of larger general systems thinking. And then we also have relational skills, and this is not just understanding how to relate to technologies out there, but also how to collaborate with technology and with different types of cohorts, different types of teams, how to come together, how to solve problems where maybe you're going to have 3 or 4 different generations of folks working together, how to really coordinate, not just across obviously distances, but time zones, some of these different domains. So, you know, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but here are some anticipated impacts of future of work innovations on at least Montana's economic sectors. So these are the economic sectors that are predominantly driving our economy. It's energy and tourism and recreation and healthcare. Now, what you have to understand is this is pre-COVID. So already when we're thinking about tourism and recreation, we have seen the advent of concierge robots, obviously digital assistants and services, big data scrubbing and trying to understand how we can actually help companies using smart agents out there. Another one that I'm really big into is real estate and construction, where we're starting to see 3D printing for material deposits, as well as educational services. Obviously, this is something that we spend a lot of time on in higher education, understanding adaptive learning experiences. So rather than sort of educating everybody en masse, now you're going to have technologies that really help individuals pace their learning, and that really builds the learning experience to what their needs are, right? So there's a lot out there. What we know is that the genie is out of the bottle, if you will, that these technologies are going to accelerate even more, that there's no turning back or turning them off. What we don't necessarily know is the speed, the scale, and sort of the standards that will emerge, and even some of the impacts out there. And I think, you know, there are some folks, including Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk at Tesla, who have talked about sort of, you know, AI being the thing that will sunset humans, if you will, right? So we are basically creating our own extinction through AI. It will outsmart us, and maybe we're going to have a Skynet event. For those of you who are Terminator fans, you're going to get that reference, which then means that, you know, these are leadership skills that are in the literature out there, talking about how you can try to at least manage teams, yourself, your organization. The acronym here is self-created. I just happen to use this one because you know, Montana is known for its craft beer, and if you think about what is happening with all this automation, all this artificial and synthetic intelligence and technology, this is really going back to sort of a handcrafted approach to leadership, right? It means that what we're doing here is we're using high touch, we're using a way to sort of, you know, connect to people. We have 5 categories here: competencies-based, relational, augmentation-oriented, future-fluent, and T-shaped. When we're thinking about competencies-based, it's really saying, okay, the organizations of tomorrow and even the jobs of tomorrow, the professions, are not going to fit the boxes that they did up until now. Even organizational charts where it was kind of like, okay, here's where the director of marketing goes, and here's where the VP of finance goes, and so on and so forth. We're going to have to disaggregate those really into the skills and competencies. And it also means that now it really becomes a lifelong learning experience in the workplace or for your professions, where leaders are really going to understand or have visibility in terms of those emerging competencies, and then equip their teams and their employees with those competencies on an ongoing basis. That will have to be shouldered by the organizations if they want to remain competitive, okay? The other thing is, more and more employees are going to want line of sight about not just what they're doing today, but what they will be doing in 3 or 4 years as they sort of evolve in the organization. When it comes to relational, here we're talking about more of the socio-economic, the socio-emotional leadership qualities. More and more, we're going to see that leadership is going to take on empathy and patience, transparency and understanding. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, so that transparency really comes in. Leaders are going to be asked to really connect the dots for their employees in the workplace to say, okay, you know, here's what's sort of on the horizon. How do we bring it in here? How do we instill a growth mindset? It's also about not pushing employees necessarily to, you know, where they can sort of max out, but rather where they want to max out. How do you how do you support them through their journey inside the organization and through their industries, especially when we think about what is going to happen with some of these jobs where, you know what, maybe it's going to be more of a gig thing. We're going to see more project management where people come in, work maybe on a project, and then sort of disengage, work with another company or another project. So there's going to be a lot of coordination that's going to require a lot of relational skills. When we're talking about augmentation oriented, this is really managing sort of the machine-human interface. And I think what's interesting is that we still hear about man versus machine, but it's more like man or human and machine, right? How do you actually augment these technologies with humans to maximize not just productivity, but also their sort of self-actualization? And I think it's interesting that, you know, we spend so much time talking about what can this machine do better than this person, this worker. I think it's actually the other way around. We got to start asking, what does this person, what does this employee do better than the machine? And once we understand that, then we'll actually figure out the implications and consequences of certain technological adoptions and which ones are there for the long term. Future fluency just means that this is sort of kicking it up into the bigger picture. What are the implications of some of these technologies on individuals, teams, organizations, as well as culture and structure throughout industries and societies? So which technologies are going to be truly enabling versus the ones that are going to be authoritarian or almost punitive, if you will? So there's a lot of discussion around workers' rights, obviously privacy issue. When we're thinking about equity and inclusion, especially in this era, are these technologies going to increase the divide, or are they going to actually sort of bridge some of the gaps out there that we see when it comes to income and other lifestyle inequalities? And then also, how do you actually bring in the diversity of experiences and also expertise across multiple generations into the workplace to solve some of these problems? I think with future fluency, it's going to be key that we actually retain the voice of the worker in that future of work. That's going to be really important. And then in terms of the T-shaped approach, this one is really trying to be a T-shaped professional, whether you're leading or working. It means that there's a real challenge when it comes to so much information, figuring out how you actually tease the noise versus the signal, being able to take that signal, being able to manage that sort of focus distraction paradox, right? And a T-shape means that you're scanning the environment for some of these emerging trends, but then figuring out which ones are the important ones and then deploying them in a fashion that are actually both efficient and effective. Oops, sorry about that. Somehow my computer. So I think that there's going to be an ongoing challenge when it comes to sort of understanding the curiosity versus sort of the concentration and competency, getting away from technology for technology's sake, and focusing more on how it's actually beneficial to the organization and to society as a whole. So this is sort of what has been going on. This is the narrative that's been playing out pre-COVID. Of course, now the question is, well, great, now what, right? As we are inundated with an unprecedented event that has made things even foggier, what's sort of the direction? And my view is that if anything, COVID and its resulting recession are already accelerating some of this future of work that was already on the horizon. Some of the emergence of the technologies out there. You think about the big reveal that happened with COVID is that it made explicit some of the fault lines in a lot of industries, also in a lot of professions, right? So already we're seeing that, you know, artificial intelligence is being deployed, obviously in combating you know, this pandemic, whether it came with Amazon buying a, you know, a personal heat sensing technology so that they can actually figure out who's running a fever in some of their warehouses. We have, for instance, some of these robots that will, enforce social distancing in parks and on beaches. But we are also seeing other things that were sort of nice to haves or interesting. For instance, Amazon with its Amazon Go, which is a cashierless store where you just go in, you grab stuff with your app, and then you walk out and automatically charges you. Well, if any one of you out there is having a hard time going to the store these days and sort of not liking the experience as much, sort of waiting in line and everything, not only is Amazon rolling out its Amazon Go, but they actually just announced a smart card where whatever you throw into your cart, it'll automatically calculate what you got. So, we're seeing amazing efficiencies being accelerated. Another one that I have here is, what is happening sort of when it comes to supply chains. We've seen supply chain disruptions. We're going to see probably blockchain adoption throughout those supply chains, but even things that, again, seem sort of on the fringe, like Beyond Meat and the Impossible Burger that you had, are now becoming really mainstays, just because that the meat processing supply chain has been contaminated. So, I think some of these things are going to be pretty positive, because we're clocking in at 7.8 billion folks, and we are living in a resource constrained environment, and the hope is that some of these technologies are going to bring in efficiencies that will, maybe move us from sort of an extraction mentality to a sustainability mentality worldwide. So it'll be interesting to see how this adoption will play out. Again, a lot of uncertainty around that. Like I said, I have some resources here if you're interested. You can learn more about it. And at this point, I will leave it to Justin to throw some questions at me.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. We've got some great questions in advance. We also had some wonderful questions come in during your presentation there. We'll just take it off in order. I mean, there was a question about how to do education in response to a lot of these forces. Tom Seekins asks, is there a role for the liberal studies, liberal arts, things like history and philosophy in this new emerging world? And if so, where do those topics fit in?
Yeah, no, I think the humanities definitely do, because again, this is about, what the human species can do better, right? And listen, artificial intelligence responds to what we feed it. So, all the things, all the biases that we have, all the problems that we have as a society, if we're not aware of those, we will just feed that into the robots and augmented reality and artificial or machine learning engines, and they will just reflect and even amplify those things. So I think the humanities, especially when it comes to not just critical thinking and problem solving, but also understanding sort of, where we've come from and how we've, hopefully evolved, and what we've learned as a species from our mistakes. It's those mistakes and even our triumphs that we need to feed into the artificial intelligence if we hope to actually make good use out of it.
Yeah, that's well put, Mike. I remember the question reminds me of a conversation I had with Michael Punk, author of The Revenant, former ambassador to the World Trade Organization, and current, I think he's vice president of public policy at Amazon. So a guy that's had a bunch of different big jobs. And I asked him about, how to educate people in this moment. And he said, you got to teach people how to think, how to write, and how to speak. And to me, like, those three things are hard to do, and they come out of the humanities and liberal studies as well.
Yep. No, I agree. And it really goes to this idea of systems thinking and this cognitive flexibility that, the well-rounded individual who also can situate humanity in a greater context, including a historical perspective, will bring a lot to the equation.
Yeah. Next question. Question about the healthcare industry, healthcare, senior care, hospitality, these industries rely heavily on traditionally immigrant population for frontline workers. We're seeing closures at the borders and different policies around immigration, particularly with COVID. So how do these industries move forward? Is this accelerating some of the trends that you're talking about here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's that pandemic overlay that, it maybe keeps us sometimes in the fog, but I think if we fly high enough, we'll get more visibility about sort of the forward-looking trend lines. So, I think, like I said before, I think some of this automation was already on path, but I really like what, two authors of Dune, Herbert and Anderson, said that history demonstrates that the advancement of technology is not a steady upward curve, but rather that it has its flat periods, upward spurts, and even reversals. And I think some industries are going to sort of pull back a little bit and try to figure it out, and others are really seeing a spurt in terms of the implementation out there. I think, there is a bigger question here too, in that maybe we're thinking of healthcare and hospitality still in the old paradigm. And I really truly believe that we might actually see a very different mode of living come out of this. This is a true shock to the system. And we don't necessarily know what awaits us on the other end. We don't know if this is the second or the seventh inning of this pandemic, right? So we sort of have to see where it'll go. But there's enough in terms of people maybe rethinking individually and collectively how they've led their life, that there's going to be a big shakeout. And we're going to see new patterns emerge on how people want to live, work, play, communicate, coordinate, all this stuff. So we shall see, but I do believe that this is the advent of a whole new volume in our society.
So it looks, Mike, like we are being joined this evening by Peter Coffey, who's the head of strategic research at
Awesome.
Salesforce. Peter submitted a question via the chat here that I will read to you so that I get it right.
Yeah.
In 2009, the H1N1 pandemic reminded the world that these sort of things happen, and there were well-considered pandemic readiness plans developed and circulated after that. But the decade that followed did not apparently include 10 years of worldwide thinking and preparation for the next time around. Is this time different? In particular, are there fourth industrial revolution technologies and behaviors that enable a more pervasive and enduring response? For example, remote work, blockchains, that simply weren't available in 2009. Will post-COVID-19 changes to workplace and society aimed at resilience and containment still be apparent in 2030? There's a lot there. Maybe take it piece by piece.
There is a lot. Thank you, Peter. And by the way, I watched your future of work at the Quote to Cast. So that was super interesting stuff. And I hope to connect with you and chew the fat on some of this. Multi-layered question. First of all, this would have been so much more difficult in some ways back in 2009 to do. I mean, I think about what we did in education, that it took us really 10 days to go fully online, as an entire industry. So the technologies were there. I think that the issue is that, we did okay with what we had, but it's still not good enough. I mean, for instance, Zoom was never meant, for instance, for education. It's a business meeting software and vehicle. So now it's really going back to some of the innovators out there who are figuring out how to take that experience and make sure that they can both do the science of education and the science of technology and blend it together. And I think a great example there is Minerva, who is really pioneering this. In terms of your question, will we learn this time? I mean, there's a lot of research out there that says till it affects you, it sort of seems distance. We're even seeing this here where, maybe in some parts of the country where the infection rates and the death rates weren't as high initially, it seemed a little bit more of, well, that's happening in, for instance, New York, right? And obviously New York did a much better job of handling the initial outbreak, and now we're seeing that some of the other states, they're feeling it firsthand. This is a pandemic, so back when we had SARS and MERS, they were more localized, and they were more like headlines in the newspaper that we sort of scrolled through. Well, now this is something that we're dealing with on a daily basis, and I think, or my hope is that not just governments, but organizations, industries in general will really deploy some of these technologies that are available to us, so we can make sure that future pandemic or future outbreaks won't necessarily take us out of the equation like this. I mean, and here's the other piece. There's a lot of brain power out there, and maybe if we can divert it from the next version of Tinder or whatever it is towards really solving some of these mission critical issues that we're facing as a nation and really as a civilization, I think we're going to be better off.
Yeah, well said, Mike. And Peter, thank you for joining us, and thanks for the question. Somewhat of a related question comes in around ethics. So in what ways is business education, including what you're doing at University of Montana, integrating ethics into preparing for the future of work? For example, the technological imperative suggests that because we can do something, that we should. For example, in healthcare, we can keep people alive for a long time, but should we? So how does ethics play out in your view of this changing landscape?
Yeah, no, it has to be part of the conversation, because again, this is not just about technology. This is about how technology impacts how we work, obviously, but also how we live and how we play and how we relate to one another. And we are at this point where technology can either help or hinder us as a society, if you will. And this is where the ethics will come in and help us sort of set the direction. And we talked about the humanities. I think that's going to be part and parcel of that. I think at the University of Montana, we're already seeing that across some of the colleges and the schools, that people are looking at various facets of future of work. So obviously in the MIS program, we have some of my colleagues who are working on it. We have folks at the Innovation Factory. Then we have across campus folks who are looking at a different facet of it. But I think the more that we can communicate about the implications of the future of work and not just sort of get enthralled by the technology for technology's sake, the more that we can actually sort of look forward and have a sense of where it might take us. And I'm a big fan of how the U.S. and especially in Silicon Valley, that there's sort of this really innovative mentality and obviously this entrepreneurial drive. At the same time, we also have to make sure that when we deploy some of these mega technologies that get quick adoption around the world, that so we can actually understand what the potential downside could be. And we're seeing now that in Washington, there's antitrust proceedings against Google and Facebook and Apple. Maybe they've become too big for their britches in terms of what they control. It'll be interesting to see what the outcome is there. We have legislation that dates back to the 80s on antitrust, and it didn't necessarily take into account these different types of platform business models that could scale up so quickly and just have a disproportionate impact on our lives.
Yeah, these are big challenges, Mike. I appreciate the question. I appreciate you speaking to it. Sometimes I lament as a marketing professor that it seems at times that best minds of our generation have dedicated themselves to engineering a better customer experience or figuring out more manipulative ways to service ads online. And you're right, like a lot of this stuff can be used to solve the big problems of our age. And this is a moment where more education is better than less. And we need to, although all these forces are disrupting all forms of how education is delivered, the product we create has never been more in need. So I appreciate those insights.
No, that's a good point.
Okay, so a couple more questions here. Question about the defense industry. So Steve Maring asks, I'm in a defense industry and have been teleworking for 4.5 months. It seems one of the hurdles for success in remote work is the cybersecurity issue. I've dedicated laptops with VPN in my work, which is beneficial. What about the consequences to industry and business with many employees using personal computing equipment to perform work for their company? This seems to be a real risk.
Oh,
So
sure.
distributed labor force and data security.
Oh yeah, and I think we've seen that. We've seen you know, sort of an explosion of cyber crimes out there. I mean, you think about especially the older generation that may not have engaged with technology on the level that they are now, and some of the vulnerabilities. But I think this is across the board where, you know, when you have you know, 40% of the workforce basically going online, you're going to have you know, you're going to have criminals, you're going to have predators, you're going to have folks who will try to take advantage of that. Again, this is sort of action and then reaction. So with it, you will have new sort of innovation. You'll have innovations that will appropriately combat that, or that will answer the call. You know, necessity here is the mother of invention. And, you know, when there's demand out there, there's usually somebody who will step up and figure it out. So, you know, I think, again, we're just getting used to this, in that it's only been 5 months that we sort of all moved online. Here we are doing our Zoom calls and everything, but already there are innovations that are coming out, because this is not good enough, right? This is sort of a temporary patch to a longer term problem. And even companies like Zoom, obviously they've seen their stock skyrocket. Now they can actually make acquisitions of other companies who have innovations and features and benefits that will actually round out some of the issues that they have. We even saw with Zoom, obviously, the Zoom bombing that happened, and they quickly came out and figured out how to come about with a patch. But you know, we weren't prepared for this, and now it's a little bit of a mad scramble to try to, you know, get ourselves at least in the short term into a sort of a period where we can manage. You know, it's cyber crimes. It's sort of the Zoom fatigue, the mental fatigue. It's you know, some of the issues that we have, just not being able to connect with people the way that we used to. We're all trying to figure out how to do workarounds.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of questions that have emerged, both coming in before our talk and in the live questions tonight, kind of revolve around people that maybe are feeling left behind or are left behind by some of these changes. Maybe they've been laid off, lost their job for a variety of reasons. Maybe they haven't had access to some of the education to prepare them for these changes, or they lack creative skills. They haven't been able to bridge the income divide. So this sort of people in those classes, how would you advise them to kind of prepare themselves for the changes that are coming or that we're living through right now?
Yeah, no, and that one is that's a really tricky issue, in that, you know, yeah, we had you know, workers who could work from home obviously make that transition, but we have so many workers and just their occupation didn't allow that, right? And that makes it really challenging. The other thing is, what we're seeing is that there's a real divide out there when it comes to accessibility to obviously the internet and any kind of signal out there that, especially rural areas have a much more challenging time in terms of accessing the internet and being able to do some of this work that they need to do or deal with anything that requires them to be online. I think that we're still going to see this play out. I don't necessarily know what the impact is sort of short term with some of the industries. I think industries are going to figure out how they can not necessarily have the reliance on face-to-face and high touch involvement, right? So some industries are going to go through a bigger upheaval than others. I mean, I think about sort of the cruise industry or hospitality, but already they're trying to figure it out and come up with ways that they can actually mitigate some of the risk out there. And it means that it'll be on them to also help their employees get retrained and upskilled and reskilled in some of those. I think the other thing is we are seeing that there is going to be a large reskilling, again, coming back to sort of the disaggregated job opportunities. If anything, the advent of some of these new professions out there is going to make people sort of migrate their skills and capability skill set to those emerging jobs, and then try to get the necessary training for it. But I've said this before, and I firmly stand by it. I mean, there has to be more of a collaborative ecosystem approach where it's not just companies by themselves or state and federal entities. I mean, this is really going to need everybody working together in a coordinated fashion to figure out how we bring people along. We bring people along across obviously sort of digital divides, generational divides, skills and training and educational divides, because otherwise what we're going to end up seeing is just sort of a bigger or even more increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Indeed. So a couple of more kind of immediately pragmatic questions, perhaps from a listener who's a small business owner or something like that.
Yeah.
What are some things that businesses right now should stop doing, and what are some things that businesses must adopt immediately?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer this more to future of work, not so much about COVID. So I think the first thing is, we sort of hear about this, the new normal and all this, and to me, again, it's one of those things where, leave the past sort of behind for now. And the first thing to do is create an awareness, a culture of learning in your organization where everybody will have a curiosity to at least be aware and learn about what this future of work entails. Now, again, this does not mean that you have to get up the curve on all the technologies that are on the horizon, but just to understand sort of, okay, what are we talking about here? And really stop sticking your head in the sand, because we're not going back. This is one of those spurts where we're going to see an acceleration of the adoption of automation in general, and it'll touch all industries. It's just a matter of the extent of disruption. I just had this conversation with somebody today. It's like, is anything really safe from any kind of disruption? And my answer is no. And I actually even think that, when we look at, our system of capitalism, that is even ripe for disruption, because again, we cannot continue to go in the direction that we've been going. It's leaving too many people behind. And again, the COVID has made a lot of the fault lines very apparent. And unless we figure out how to address those collectively, they're just going to amplify.
Yeah, as kind of a related follow-up to that line of thinking, Peter Coffey comes in with a follow-up question I think will be an interesting thought idea for you, Mike. Speaking of Zoom, you mentioned Zoom before. It was noted in May that Zoom now has a market cap greater than the world's seven largest airlines combined. So Peter asks, is this an example of a new form of competition based on the need that's met rather than the thing that's made or the service that's performed? So do people and companies need to broaden our definition of what competition is?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting question. I mean, I think Zoom was there. I think there were companies that just ended up with the wind on their back. This is about capital flows. So where's the capital flowing right now? Sure, it's going to go to Zoom, but there are going to be so many other companies. I mean, there's a company called Magic Leap that does augmented reality, and there are so many shortcomings with Zoom. And I'm looking forward to companies like Magic Leap that will allow you to basically sit in your living room and have, avatars, virtual avatars. So we wouldn't have to do this, me staring at the screen here at you, Justin, and everybody else, but instead, we can sit around and we can actually sort of see a 3D rendering of one another. So I think it's about capital flows right now. And right now the capital is flowing to the must-haves that really allay the fears and mitigate the risks. So, there are obviously plexiglass companies and soap companies and hand sanitizer companies and so on and so forth that are doing really well. But once the dust settles, then we'll sort of have to see, what the priorities and how we actually want to work. There's going to be so many issues, so many challenges, so many problems that will come to the forefront. I do think it's interesting that, you have companies like Twitter and obviously Facebook who have said you'll never have to come back to the office. Some folks are saying that's the end of commercial real estate. I don't think so. I think there's going to be a strategic role for commercial real estate, but you're going to see that technology is going to come in and just, sort of round out some of the shortcomings with working at home, or then, and we're going to see these things play out on multiple levels. We're going to see individuals, we're going to see entire communities adapt to some of these new challenges. Sure, some folks are going to move. Right now, people are spending a lot of money sort of, equipping their home office and making it comfortable. But again, it's about the capital flows. Capital always goes to where the need is. And there are going to be companies that will really focus on solutions of people who, they want to work, and they want to work because they have to work and it makes them feel good and everything else. So let's just say it'll be interesting.
So last question. It's always nice, Mike, when one of your colleagues jumps in to heckle you a little bit. So you got a question from Professor Cameron Lawrence. It seems that the fourth industrial revolution will require all of us to have stronger grounding in technology, regardless of our individual occupations. How can universities help students ramp up their technical skills and systems thinking?
Yeah, no, and I think the best person to answer that question is Cameron himself.
Perhaps.
But I do think that increasingly, we're going to see interdisciplinary efforts across campuses and across the ecosystems where universities are located. What do I mean by that? And Justin, you know this, and having been in academia for 15 years, there's really a silo mentality.
Yeah.
I mean, you can spend 10 years on a campus and not run into folks from other schools, from other departments, from other colleges. I think those days are over. So these interdisciplinary efforts, they're going to span not just campuses, but also across some of the regional ecosystems where, increasingly colleges and universities are going to have to get informed by obviously for-profits, nonprofits, economic development agencies, government entities, so on and so forth, about what those needs are to solve. And by working together, we're going to move from sort of a supply side system where we said, here's 4 years of your degree, now go find a job, to no, actually, we're going to work with different constituencies to create students who can actually sort of live through multiple career phases, and also live life to the fullest.
Well, Michael, that seems like a great way to bring the conversation to a close. Thanks for sharing your expertise. Thanks for the wonderful questions from our engaged audience this evening. And please join us. Yeah. So please join us next week when our colleague, professor and interim dean at the College of the Arts and Media, John DeBoer, will join us to discuss the arts, arts during the pandemic. John will have many virtual masterpieces to share with us on July 29th. And check out my latest podcast at anewanglepodcast.com. In the last 2 weeks, we've published episodes with University of Montana head men's basketball coach Travis DeCure, as well as University of Montana political scientist Rob Saldine, who recently published a book called Never Trump. On behalf of the University of Montana Alumni Association, thanks for coming. Thanks for your questions. Good night. Take care and go Grizz.